Solomon Shereshevsky showed up to a morning editorial meeting at a Moscow newspaper in 1920 and did not write a single thing down. His editor noticed. Every other reporter in the room was scribbling notes. Solomon sat there with his hands in his lap, watching. The editor called him in afterward. Solomon repeated the entire briefing back. Every assignment, every name, every address, every figure, word for word, in the exact order they had been given. The editor sent him to see a psychologist. He thought something might be wrong. The psychologist was Alexander Luria. He was 23 years old and had just begun his career. He would spend the next 30 years trying to find the edge of Solomon's memory. He never found one. Luria began with standard tests. He read Solomon a list of numbers. 70 numbers. Solomon repeated them back without error. Luria flipped his notepad over. Solomon repeated them in reverse. Luria asked him to recall the list 4 years later, without warning, in the middle of a completely different session. Solomon closed his eyes for a few seconds and read the numbers off as if from a page inside his head. The list hadn't faded. It had never faded. None of them ever did. What Luria was observing had a name, though a precise diagnosis didn't exist for it yet. Solomon had what researchers would later call highly superior autobiographical memory combined with an involuntary and total form of synesthesia. Every piece of information that entered his mind arrived attached to a texture, a color, a taste, a sound, a physical sensation. A number wasn't just a number. The number 1 was a proud, well-built man. The number 8 was a large and very sentimental woman. When Luria read Solomon a sequence, Solomon didn't memorize it. He walked through it. He placed each piece along an imaginary street in a city he had constructed in his mind, each item attached to an image at a specific address. To recall the list, he simply walked the street again and read the signs. He called it a walk. That was the word he used. He just went for a walk. Luria published a series of papers. The scientific community was interested. Solomon was eventually persuaded to perform publicly, and he did, for decades, on stages across the Soviet Union and later elsewhere. The acts were extraordinary. Audiences would shout numbers, foreign words, nonsense syllables, and Solomon would absorb everything and recall it in any order requested. Mathematicians tested him with formulas he didn't understand. Linguists tested him in languages he had never studied. He got everything right. He always got everything right. And then the performances would end, and Solomon would go home. Here is the part Luria wrote about with something that reads almost like grief. Solomon could not hold a job. Not because he was incapable of learning the work. He had learned every detail of every job he had ever tried. He could not hold a job because he could not stop remembering. A supervisor would speak to him and Solomon would hear not just the words, but every previous conversation he had ever had with that person, arriving simultaneously, overlapping, crowding. A simple instruction became a noise. A noise became paralysis. He worked as a newspaper reporter and was let go because he could not edit. He remembered every version of every sentence he had ever written and could not decide between them. He worked as a mnemonist, a professional rememberer, and this was the only work that fit because it was the only work that required him to do exactly what he could not stop doing. His personal life was quieter but not better. He married a woman named Lena. They had a son. The son later said that his father could tell him every detail of every day they had ever shared and could not remember how old the boy was. Solomon forgot faces. This sounds strange for a man who forgot nothing, but faces change. The face of his wife at 40 was not the face of his wife at 25. Each time he saw her, he had to reconcile the face in front of him with the dozens of previous faces stored in perfect detail. Faces drifted and his memories did not. He preferred to recognize people by their voices, which were more stable. If someone changed their voice, he lost them entirely. He could not read literature for pleasure. A sentence was never just a sentence. Every word arrived with its full weight of texture and association, piling images on top of images until the original meaning collapsed under what it had triggered. He could not follow conversations easily. By the time a person reached the end of a thought, Solomon was still inside the beginning of it, watching the images from the first words multiply. He tried, at various points, to forget things deliberately. He would write a number on a piece of paper and burn it, believing the act of destruction might release it from his mind. It didn't work. He tried not writing things down, believing that perhaps the physical act of encoding helped fix memory. That didn't work either. He tried imagining his memories written on a board and then imagining the board being erased. He stood in the dark and watched memories refuse to leave. Luria wrote that Solomon was a man haunted not by what he had lost, but by everything he had kept. By the end of his life, Solomon was performing his mnemonist shows into old age because there was nothing else that made use of what he was. He died in 1958. Luria published the full account of their work together in 1968, 10 years after Solomon's death, under a title that translated roughly as The Mind of a Mnemonist. It was one of the most unusual case studies ever written in clinical psychology. Luria described it not as a scientific report, but as something between a story and a portrait. He had known Solomon for 3 decades, and he still could not fully explain him. The popular reading of Solomon's life has always focused on the gift. The impossible recall, the constructed cities, the numbers retrieved years later like books pulled from a shelf that never moved. But Luria's own conclusion was different. He wrote that memory, in its ordinary form, does its job partly through forgetting. Forgetting is not a failure. It is the mechanism that allows the mind to extract meaning from experience, to let moments become patterns, to let patterns become understanding. Solomon could not extract meaning because he could not compress. Everything remained equally vivid, equally present, equally loud. He remembered everything. He understood almost nothing. And Luria believed, in the end, that this was not a variation of the human mind. It was the human mind in a state that the human mind was never designed to occupy. Memory is not a library. It is an editor. And Solomon was a man who could never edit a single page of the book he had been given. He walked through his perfect cities every day for nearly 60 years. Every street exactly as he had built it. Every sign exactly where he had placed it. He could not find the exit.